As Carl said, we're coming from the Quantitative Assessment Methods section at the Pacific Biological Station, mostly in Nanaimo, working for Fisheries and Oceans Canada. We're a relatively new section. We were formed in 2016, and with the remit to develop quantitative assessment methods and tools to support fisheries management decisions. To develop decision analysis tools, including closed-loop simulation and management strategy evaluation. And most of our members are involved in one of those things in one way or another. So that's what we thought we'd like to talk to you about today. We also engage in primary fisheries research as well. We collaborate with others at PBS in the Stock Assessment and Research Division, primarily colleagues in the groundfish and inshore and salmon assessment sections. We have DFO colleagues nationally, which we'll mention briefly at the very end when we tell you some of our upcoming projects. And we also collaborate with you guys, with external colleagues in academia and also in the private sector and with the fishing industry as well. So why are we here today? Well, because we're new, we haven't really had a chance to introduce ourselves to you, and we feel that the Strait of Georgia isn't wide, but it's a barrier enough to stop us from coming over and meeting you guys. And our team, we're really at the coalface of fisheries management decision making and science in support of that, so we thought it would be great for us to come here and meet you and to provide some real world examples of management strategy evaluation in BC's groundfish, pelagic and salmon fisheries, and to share our experiences and lessons learned in real life MSC work. So people don't have to introduce themselves one by one. I'll briefly talk about today's speakers. There's myself, Rob Crumland, who Carl introduced. Unfortunately, Brendan Connors, Jacqueline Cleary, Kendra Holt have all been weathered in on the island. Their seaplanes weren't flying, so we will muddle through and try to present their stuff ourselves. And also Kerry Andy here. And you can see our relative roles on that slide. And with that, I'll hand over to Rob Crumland to give you an overview of management strategy evaluation.
My role is a bit different from my colleagues. I was in the Pacific region for about 30 years, working in the last 15 or so in groundfish. And then last fall, I took a position in Ottawa. And part of my job is to look at what's happening with management strategy evaluation nationally, find out, first of all, what's going on, what's working well, what's not working, what are the challenges that various MSC processes are facing nationally. And as we work from left to right in the means-ends diagram, you keep asking the question of why is a particular step or objective important? So why do we collect stock and fishery data? So we want to do stock assessments. You go the other way, why is it important? How do we achieve the objective? Doing a stock assessment, we need some data. So you can work back and forth along the means-ends diagram. At the far right is the objective of sustainable fisheries, and why do we want that? We just do. And when you answer to a question is we just do, then you know you've found an ends objective. So it seems pretty simple, the path seems clear, except then this happens in terms of what matters for sustainable fisheries. And we live down in the science world where there's ecological values related to things like stock productivity, spatial distribution, stock structure, and then there's everything else, and they come under the general categorization of, say, governance, economics, social, cultural issues, and I won't go through each one, that's not important. The important thing is there's a lot of stuff other than science things that bear on fisheries management decisions. And we don't have a lot to say about that either because we don't have the expertise or just because it's not our business to say anything. It seems though that everybody else has a lot to say about the science, and you can experience that if you go to any DFO stock assessment meeting. Everybody else has an opinion about the science. The net effect of that is about at the point in the means-ends diagram where you're setting reference points and status, things start to get foggy. And as you go further towards sustainable fisheries, which is, I checked the recent literature on sustainable fisheries, it's still being debated rather actively what it means, but it gets less clear about how the flow from data decision goes. And so we end up at the end with values-related decisions that are influenced by everyone else, not science, that can be said not to be science-based, but science-informed. So the situation is that values from everybody else mean that decisions often depart from science-driven ecological values. And one of the problems, I think, is that science is a study culture, and that's used to postpone decisions in the sense that we need more data, we need to reduce uncertainty. But I can tell you decisions are going to be made regardless of whether we think there should be more study. Even decisions of no change will be made. That's a decision. It's not necessarily risk-free, but decisions will be made annually in the case of most DFO fisheries. And so we have an option. We could change from a study culture to a decision-making culture that's informed by science. And there's a recent article by Rick Mulhorn and colleagues talking about the issue of fishery sustainability. They had their take on sustainability, but one of the messages out of it was that we require a process, that successful fishery management systems have an established process. So one of the things I think I've learned about recently, I work a lot with Sean Cox at SFU. I understand SFU's got a bad rap here, but and that's funny because yeah, I'm sure he'll come back and talk to you about it, Carl. I think in our headlong rush to get to fun things like collecting data, analyzing data, and building models, we skip this step, and that's the decision context. What I'm observing nationally is I think I need to slow down and think about what decision we're trying to make and what time frames we have to make those decisions in, who's supposed to be involved in that decision making and what are the roles, how are we going to actually make the final decision, and when and how should we update that process. So under sort of a general disciplined structured decision making, you can make a schematic like the one that I adapted here. So the decision context is at the top, and moving on to some statement of objectives and how we measure performance of our decisions relative to those objectives. A set of some choices, consideration of the effects of uncertainty, the expected consequences of that uncertainty, some evaluation of various trade-offs that result from our choices, and then a decision to implement that choice and learn from the response of the real system to that particular choice. Now, I understand that Tom gave a talk recently on MSC, so he's made my life easier. I don't have to dig down into the weeds too much, but MSC is just a form of structured decision making. It also has the decision context, but I think all resource management probably should start with. And we get in fisheries a little more stringent about measurable objectives and matching statistics to measure performance of those objectives. So every objective will have some sort of performance measure. And we tend to cast things in terms of the outcome or the state, which is what you want or what matters. Duration, which is the time frame over which you want to evaluate performance. And probability, or how badly you want that particular outcome. The choices we call management procedures, which is the collection of choices of stock and fishery monitoring data. An assessment method, it could be something as simple as a trend analysis, it could be something quite sophisticated like a catch age analysis or stage-based model. And coupled with a harvest control rule to translate the assessment outputs into some sort of catch limitation or effort limitation or when it was appropriate. We talked about operating models, and I'm sure Tom talked about that last week, and they're basically a statement of a hypothesis about how the stock and fishery dynamics are working. And a lot of justifications for a management strategy and evaluation approach are based on the sort of unsatisfactory philosophy of trying to pick the right best model and basing your policy decisions on one model. MSC is a response to that dilemma by trying to acknowledge that there's more than one explanation about what's going on in the real stock of fishery, given uncertainty, and then checking to see, well, are my decisions in terms of management implementation going to be robust to that uncertainty? And the technical underpinnings, or sort of the computing foundation of that process, is DFAT simulation, where each of the choices represented by management procedures is essentially test-driven against the hypotheses of alternative operating models. So every hypothesis gets the a set of management procedures, test drive driven against data that an operating model will simulate. Hopefully those data are reasonably realistic, but conditioned on the assumptions and data that are input to the operating model. Trade-offs, I think that's the essence of the fishery management decision is you can't get complete agreement with all objectives. Objectives all conflict to some degree. You can't minimize conservation risk and maximize catch. So decision makers need to be presented with outputs that help them evaluate trade-offs that result from different choices of management options. The implement and learn is basically pick a preferred management procedure and apply it consistently. So I think this definition of MSC is way back in work that I did with Sean Cox on Sablefish. And this probably is his more than mine, but this is the most succinct one-liner for a definition I've seen. So it's a systematic determination of the expected performance of a fishery management system against a set of objectives. So once again, operating models generate realistic, in quotes, it's a challenging thing to do, future stock and fishery data that's conditioned on your past data and assumptions that make up the hypothesis about what might be going on for this. And the feedback simulation is a test drive. How well could we do if we actually implemented a particular choice of management actions in real life? And this, if you go back to the 1995 FAO definition of precautionary approach to fisheries management, it's called prospective evaluation. And the objective is to try to find a set of management actions that's robust to uncertainty. And the advantage is you get do-overs. You don't risk the actual stock and fishery. So I've only been in my current position for about 6 months, so I've ferreted out these various MSE processes or MSE-like processes that are going on within the department or through Canada's involvement with international fisheries organizations. And there's more than I thought there was. Most are in the planning or under construction stage, if you will, and some are more MSE-like than others, and by that I mean they may be more like a desktop closed-loop simulation exercise as opposed to a process that involves a lot of stakeholder interaction, which is really the DNA of MSE. A few are operational, Sablefish in Pacific, Western Paul in the Maritimes, and Greenland and Halibut, which is through NAFO. And what I'm seeing so far is all of them share some common challenges, and most of those challenges are related to people and process. Certainly there are technical issues with model development, as Murdoch and Roberto are learning with redfish, but a lot of the problems are related to the way people interact and make decisions. And most of those challenges existed prior to initiating the MSE. What I hear a lot from some senior folks is, why is the MSE taking so long? Why isn't it working? Well, it's because of the challenges that existed prior to deciding to go forward with an MSE. So just to give you, I won't go through all of these in detail, but I want to highlight a couple of them. One thing I'm learning to ask when I find an MSE process and start to interact with the people that are involved with it is, why are you doing this to begin with? Was there another way to solve the problem? They tend to be resource intensive, a lot of interaction with stakeholders, First Nations, for example. And so I think the first step is to consider whether you really need it to solve the question at hand, which is back to the decision context issue. So attention to decision context is good. And one thing that's come up is the role of analysts. A lot of analysts feel that they have to defend the ramparts of conservation, if you will. And really, I think the role of analysts in the process is to portray consequences of various choices rather than to get glued to a particular set of objectives related to conservation or some other value. Objectives. All those stumbling blocks seem to come down to a misstatement or an incomplete statement of objectives. So that's a pretty common thread through what I'm seeing. Another one, and I'll skip down the list to the loss of momentum. What kills MSE processes is long silences while modelers go away and build operating models and don't interact with the people involved. You get process fatigue, you You get lots of continuity. It takes a long time to build group capacity. You have to understand the machinations behind MSC. So unless you identify sort of some bite-sized chunks and quick milestones to show momentum, people get tired of it. They wonder what's taking so long. Why aren't we hearing from the analysts that are working on the model? So I think one of the things we've learned, and I committed this in Sablefish too, but is to set sort of bite-sized chunks that you can show progress and not go away for long periods of time without interaction with stakeholders. And that's related to the final bullet, which is something called Gall's Law. I don't know if you know it, but Gall actually was a pediatrician, and for some reason he wrote this book called Systemantics, How Systems Really Work and How They Fail. I don't know what possessed a pediatrician to do that, but the first of Gall's Law is that a complex system that works is invariably found to evolve from a simple system that works. So start with a simple system that works if you engage in an MSC process. And the problem is, the corollary is that a complex system designed from scratch never works. And it cannot be patched up to make it work. You have to start over again with a simple system. And I see that problem occurring frequently throughout processes. So that was a brief flyby, non-technical intro to MSC, because Tom did the technical stuff last week, and probably somewhat faster than I just did my presentation. Sablefish, I've been involved in since 2001. And I don't know if you know much about sablefish, but contrary to popular opinion, this is the most perfect fish on the coast, not some other contenders. They're fast growing, age of maturity around 5 or 6 years, relatively long lived. I think the oldest that we've sampled in BC so far is 93 years. They don't have a swim bladder, which means you can tag them. They can be found at really great depths, although the commercial fishery tends to concentrate between about 1,500 and 2,700 feet. I actually think that fathoms, like, it was easy for me to convert to feet, sorry about no meters. They're really mobile. Everybody says, oh, halibut migrate a lot. No, the figure shows some tagging data. The green dots on the map are where the sablefish in BC were released, and then they were recovered at either the purple dots in Alaska, Bering Sea, or down the west coast of the U.S. So they're capable of long movements. They're also goofy because fish from the same tagging cohort can be found up in the Aleutians a year later, or right on the spot where you tag them. I'm not sure why that happens. They're caught in commercial trap, longline, hook, and trawl gears. Groundfish fishery in BC has 100% at-sea monitoring, dockside validation of landings. Sablefish have a 55-centimeter size limit in Canada, not in U.S. jurisdictions. And we run a fishery-independent trap survey and tag release recapture program on them. And we have a history of over 25 years of collaborative work with the Canadian Sablefish Association. They're a forward-looking group, and been a real pleasure to collaborate with over the years. There were some exciting incidents that started to develop. The survey bottomed out and caused quite a bit of consternation. To that point, and indeed through the early 2000s, assessment models were changing almost annually. The decision-making process was unclear, primarily due to a lack of objectives, and there was some unclear communication of science outputs to stakeholders, and comments like, this is too complicated, it's inconsistent with our real-world experience, does not reflect fish on the grounds, why does the model change all the time? We had disagreement between scientists working on sablefish, between fishermen, processors, the NGOs. It wasn't particularly a coordinated effort to come up with good management decisions for sablefish. Also, the emergence of new DFO policy that we were struggling to learn about and implement. And a lot of haggling about what the TA should be that was unrelated to the modeling program. So why do we do an MSC for sablefish? Because Sean Cox and Steve Martell said we should. They did an independent review in 2004-05, and their recommendation was pretty firm. We should investigate an MSC for sablefish to try to deal with some of the inciting incidents. It's been 3 cycles so far, ending in 2008, 2010, and sort of crossed over into 2015 and 16. And very, very briefly, cycle 1, we didn't get launch. The preferred management procedure developed at that time was database based on basically a smoothing of the survey. And it wasn't adopted. It suggested about a 50% reduction should happen to the TAC, and fishery managers and the industry followed to that. Nevertheless, the good part of cycle 1 was that a reduction was agreed to of about 30%. But it did do another thing, establish the process of MSC. Database procedures let the fishermen participate immediately because they could literally calculate the TAC for a particular database rule on the back of a napkin, and they did so in meetings, and that got some engagement. Another problem we ran into with cycle 1 was it was difficult to define limit reference points for sablefish based on concepts of serious harm, because I think as Carl and Ray Kilmore said some years ago, serious harm is really only detectable once you're already past it. So we had difficulty with limit reference points in the first cycle. Cycle 2, we settled on a production model-based MD that did get traction and was applied to the fishery through till 2015. The good part about that was feedback control got instituted into the management of sablefish. My own views of feedback control is one of the key things that you can get involved in a successful fishery management system. It reduced the haggling with the quota setting exercise annually under the management procedure. It took about 5 minutes as opposed to a day-long or 2-day-long meeting and then a couple of weeks of haggling after the fact. We had good engagement with the fishing industry and with fishing managers. Cycle 3, continuing with the production model-based MD. The operating model for sablefish is actually a fairly sophisticated catch-age model, but the management procedure is fairly simple. The last cycle improved the operating model, added some TAC stability constraints to the management procedure, and it's ongoing at the moment. I think I'll skip that one and just talk about where things are going. Well, first of all, Brendan Connors has recently joined the station. He'll be taking over the sablefish file. Sean Cox will continue to be involved in sablefish and Malcolm Wyatt is our really good survey lead, and we rely on him for our primary data sources. There's good evidence of stock growth in Alaska and BC, so we're hopeful there that we can build on that. Proposal to work jointly with the U.S., given the mobility of sablefish, to develop a coast-wide operating model. And in BC now, we're going to have to consider game patch and marine zoning, where we may not have access with assessment surveys to significant portions of the coast. Sublegal releases, mortality of sublegal releases is an issue that we're wanting to work on. And then there's some improvements to the data stream to improve estimates of selectivity.
Thanks, Rob. I'm going to go through Pacific herring relatively briefly, just because Jacqueline Cleary, who's the lead program head on Pacific herring, isn't here today. But I will say, even though I'll go through this first, Pacific herring is one of the most important management strategy evaluation processes we have going on the coast at the moment. And it is an ongoing process. So way back in the 1980s, Pacific herring was really at the frontier of stock assessment. It was one of the most quantitative fisheries stock assessment models that we had. Harvest control rule was introduced in 1986, which is really early for having harvest control rules in fisheries in BC. And harvest control rule is here. And basically we have the stock status in terms of biomass on the x-axis and the harvest rate on the y-axis. And just the basic fact of that is that when the stock was estimated to be at 30% of B0, you start to decrease the fishing mortality rate really rapidly, and then the fishery closes at about 0.25 of B0. And that was intended to encourage rapid recovery of herring stocks, and it was simulation tested back in the 90s. And the idea was that the management procedure would achieve a balance between yield, variability of yield, and frequency of closures in the fishery. And the simulations predicted a very, very small chance of fisheries closures. However, the harvest control rule was applied between 1986 and 2013. And 3 of the fisheries haven't done well. The Haidawai fishery has been closed in 39% of years, Central Coast 21% of years, and West Coast Vancouver Island 28% of years. And Haidawai and West Coast Vancouver Island have been closed for about the last decade to commercial fishing, and Central Coast is only open at a very small amount. So there's a mismatch really between the model and the management procedure and processes that we don't understand that are going on in herring dynamics and fishery. Including we understand that there's time during natural mortality. It's very important in prey species on the coast, and the environment has changed also. Observed changes in water age, which has been decreasing. And the current ecosystem conditions are not the same as they were in the 1980s. A lot of people like to look to the increased biomass of marine mammals, for example, as predators. So, how did we get started? By we, I mean Jacqueline Cleary and her team, and also Sean Cox and Landmark Fisheries Research as well have been very engaged in this. I've just been very, very peripherally involved. But started with everything. Coastwide approach, 5 major stocks. 2015 there were objective discussions with commercial industry and First Nations. And those highlighted some real difference in the spatial scale of objectives. And so work started on aggregated and spatial operating models, which brought us to a sort of a second thought stage where we learned and we scoped and we re-scoped and tried to carve off manageable chunks to produce shorter-term milestones to maintain momentum and avoid this participant fatigue that Rob just spoke about. So now we're just down to having pilots. We've started pilot studies on the West Coast Vancouver Island and Strait of Georgia stocks to avoid delay in the process while we develop more complex spatial operating models. So the narrowed scope, the choice of these 2 stocks is just because they have contrasting stock histories, so we think we will learn more. And the development of objectives is most advanced with the West Coast Vancouver Island nations, that's the Chalmers nations. And working with them, Jacqueline and Ashleen Benson and team have worked really hard with the Chalmers, and they've worked really hard as well, and that's resulted in a really comprehensive list of measurable means and ends objectives. And some of those objectives can already be evaluated now using non-spatial operating models. Just reinforcing that this is a participatory and iterative process that should not be postponed while the scientists make their models perfect. And so that's a really big lesson learned very quickly for the Pacific herring. With that, I'll hand it to you.
So I am presenting on behalf of myself and my supervisor, Kendra Holt, who is stranded on Vancouver Island. We started this project about a year ago on southern BC Chinook salmon. Southern BC being defined as about 400 streams, aggregated into about 35 conservation units or CUs that cover approximately the lower half of BC as it stands now. Oops, wrong button. So just to give you an overview of how this population interacts with fisheries, got this diagram here showing that Chinook salmon are harvested both as mature and immature fish at sea, as well as being harvested in terminal fisheries. And these fisheries, especially at sea, are multiple mixed stock fisheries. They span from Alaska to Washington. There's a complex mixture of international and domestic management measures, including the Canada-US Pacific Salmon Treaty. An additional layer of complication on top of that is that production in southern BC is heavily influenced by hatcheries. About 40 million juveniles are released annually with the intent to increase fishery harvest. Okay, so some of the issues that trigger this process are broad-scale declines and spawning abundances in many CUs since the 1990s, despite actions already taken to reduce harvest. So you can see this map here showing certain CUs of Chinook salmon that were assessed in 2012, and as you can see, there's a lot of red on that map, which means there's a lot of populations that have been deemed to be in the critical zone, as well as a lot of populations that haven't been assessed yet or are data deficient. Some potential threats to these populations that have been identified are, of course, harvest, as well as changes in freshwater and marine habitats, as well as effects of hatchery releases on wild populations and climate change. Additionally, Chinook prey limitations have been identified as a key threat in the northern and southern resident killer whale action plan. So the Chinook Strategic Planning Initiative supports strategy 4 of the wild salmon policy, which is concerned with integrated strategic planning. So more specifically, strategy 4.2, which is the design and implementation of a fully integrated strategic planning process for salmon conservation. So this is a collaborative planning process with First Nations and other stakeholders supported by a multi-party technical working group. Initial work by this strategic planning initiative has focused on identifying 27 high-level strategies that are intended to guide more detailed decision-making. Across all of this work, there's been a strong emphasis on adaptive management, including estimating the effects of different management actions in the face of critical uncertainties. And this is where management strategy evaluation really comes in. So the first step, as we've already heard, is defining the decision context. This is where you meet the stakeholders, you figure out what do people really want to know. So questions like how do alternative management procedures compare in terms of their ability to recover depleted CUs? How would fishery reductions impact recovery times if marine survival continues to be poor? How can we optimize fisheries, harvest stocks with variable productivity? Can we use things like space and time closures to target certain populations that have shown good productivity? And how can non-fishery management actions compare to those that focus on harvest alone? So what if we change things like hatchery inputs? What if we can make habitat improvements to try to increase productivity of stocks? How do those compare to simple harvest reductions? So it really comes down for us the 3 H's: harvest, hatcheries, and habitat. So for us, a really important step in defining the decision context was to build a really simple kind of proof of concept operating model that we could show initial results to stakeholders, just to kind of get an idea of what they want, what are their objectives. And this first stab at a model has what we call perfect information. We pretend like we know everything about the stock. There's no observation uncertainty. We have 6 management units. We have 4 fishery groupings and constant exploitation rates, which are relative to recent levels. And these have been really important for identifying next steps. There's always that urge to start really complicated and build a model that will be your final feedback simulation, but what was really important here was kind of showing them what a model could look like so that they could tell us, where is more complexity needed for decision making. And it brings up other issues, like for us is one that's been really important is how do you actually measure recovery, and then you start getting into your objectives and performance measures. So just to summarize some important lessons we've learned. Defining the decision context and management objectives is a significant undertaking, as has been said by all the speakers before me. Engaging with stakeholders and figuring out what are their objectives, what do they want. It has really benefited from an iterative approach, showing them that first simple model and seeing how they react to it, how they react to the outputs, whether they find them valuable, what else they want in their outputs. There's often the need to scale the role of MSC analysis in relation to larger decision-making contexts. So like I just said, resisting the urge to start big. What is the minimum level of detail and space and time that is needed to support decision-making? What's kind of the smallest useful unit that you can come up with as a first step? And like I've kind of already described, just really driving it home, having a preliminary analysis to present early on, even with lots of caveats, helps to demonstrate proof of concept and foster ongoing support. The first model we built, you always hesitate to present outputs because you're like, these are super wonky, I want to wait till it's perfect to present it, but you can't let perfection get in the way of progress, and it's best to just show those results and see what stakeholders think and carry on from there. Brendan Connors is also stranded on Vancouver Island right now. He brought some work with him to DFO on subsistence and commercial Chinook salmon in Western Alaska and Yukon. And this is just, all of the slides are just boiled down to his lessons learned. objectives, support, understand, and document them, and build minimally complex models to inform them. Even MSc-like processes, not a full MSc process, can help minimize conflicts by building trust and reducing the chances of doing science. And to produce something useful for policymakers and stakeholders, include them early and include them often, include them every step of the way to avoid going into the dark room, doing a bunch of analysis that come back and they say no.
So I'm going to talk about some work on chum salmon with Brooke Davis. Chum salmon is a data-limited species, and that the essence of spawn abundances are relatively imprecise and often lacking in the recruitment time series. However, management attention is increasing on them, in part because of harvest restrictions on other salmon species.
Can you use a mic?
Oh.
Very, very.
So, working on chum salmon, data-limited species. Under the Canada's World Salmon Policy, we're required to assess status of populations or conservation units into 3 zones of status: green, amber, and red, representing increasingly depleted populations, delineated by 2 benchmarks, lower and upper benchmarks. Previous work has focused on data-rich species and identifying these benchmarks based on stock recruitment relationships. And so our challenge is to evaluate how alternative benchmarks for data-limited populations compare to these data-rich benchmarks to ensure that we're consistent in our assessments across salmon species and across the region. The model-based benchmarks for data-rich populations were derived from stock recruitment relationships and include 80% of spawner abundances at maximum at MSY as an upper benchmark, and SGen as a lower benchmark, which is the spawner abundances that will result in rebuilding to SMSY within 1 generation under equilibrium conditions. And some alternative lower and upper benchmarks that have been suggested or proposed are the 25th and 75th percentile to observe spawner abundances. And these have been recommended in part based on their application in Alaska to spawning escapement goals. However, there's the risk that these percentile-based benchmarks will ratchet downwards as spawner abundances decline, and therefore may not be sufficiently precautionary. We have some examples of chum populations where we have spawner recruitment data, so we looked retrospectively to see how these percentile-based benchmarks and data-rich model-based benchmarks compared on the historical time series. However, this doesn't consider the large uncertainties and possible biases in model-based benchmarks. So, alternatively, using a closed-loop simulation model, we can compare these percentile-based benchmarks to true underlying benchmarks, given that we know what the true underlying system is. Firstly, how do percentile-based benchmarks for data-limited populations of chum salmon compare with the true underlying model-based benchmarks within a closed-loop simulation? So this closed-loop simulation is similar to what's been described before with an operating model management procedure. However, in contrast to previous projects, this was a science-led project where we just wanted to compare benchmarks and didn't include the larger stakeholders as a project development and implementation phases. We also looked at which parameters of the operating model is benchmark performance most sensitive. So under what range of conditions do these percentile-based benchmarks match the model-based benchmarks? And thirdly, to what extent do management procedures that include percentile-based benchmarks achieve candidate management objectives? And this is ongoing. Even if these percentile-based benchmarks are imprecise, they may still adequately achieve certain management objectives. So what we've found is that data-limited benchmarks provide similar assessments of data-rich benchmarks when productivity is moderate to high and harvest rates are low to moderate. However, this is not the case under low productivity and high harvest rates. And under these conditions, the concurrent declines in abundances and percentage benchmarks can result in status assessments that are overly optimistic due to shifts in baseline. And so we identify guidelines that can help identify where the percentile benchmarks are appropriate and when they're not. And I'll just briefly describe a new project that just started on evaluating rebuilding plans for depleted conservation units of Pacific salmon. This is being led by our postdoc, Cameron Freshwater, also with Kevin Holtz and Anne Ryan. And our goal is to develop a generic closed-loop simulation tool to evaluate rebuilding harvest strategies for Pacific salmon in the context of mixed stock fisheries. These are fisheries on multiple conservation units of varying status and environmentally driven changes in productivity and synchrony among those conservation units, which may prevent rebuilding. And this tool will help respond to, for example, recent recommendations for listing by COSEWIC of designated use of sockeye salmon and proposed changes to the Fisheries Act, which further support rebuilding plans for all species and the implementation of the wild salmon policy. And we'll start off with case studies on Fraser River sockeye and Nass River chum to span and data rich 3 to 4 examples. And so I'd be happy to talk with anyone afterwards about that.
Thanks. I'm just going to go through this one super fast. This was a sort of a sacrificial case study in case we run out of time. This is a paper that Kendra, Rob, and I, we have just got the final edits back from Andre Punt this morning. I haven't looked at them, so hopefully it's going to be published soon. 2 stocks. This is a desktop exercise, one of the closed-loop simulation exercises that we talked about that hasn't involved development of objectives, just using some generic objectives for Pacific cod and rock sole, 2 groundfish species, caught in the trawl fishery in BC. So the issue is that both species have large uncertainty in natural mortality. For Pacific cod, we have possible density dependence in adult natural mortality, which has led to sort of cyclic abundance. And rock sole is just a general large range of possible values in natural mortality that can't be resolved with the available data. And this has led to unreliable estimates of FMSY and BMSY, very, very sensitive to model inputs. And so it sort of follows that it's not, you may have a policy that's based on MSY, but it may not be possible to follow through with that policy if you have huge uncertainty in some of these equilibrium-based reference points. And so one of the motivators for doing this work was the need to understand the performance of history-based and other alternative operational control points in the harvest control rule. And by history-based, I mean the, so first of all, we'll start on this side here. Operational control points are really the points in your harvest control rule that trigger a decision. So if we have the fishing mortality rate on the y-axis and stock status on the x-axis, once you reach a certain upper stock reference, you start declining your fishing mortality until you reach your cutoff point at which you shut off the fishery. And so these can be based on different metrics. And so they can be based on FMSY and BMSY, so they could be down here. This is spawning biomass. Or they could be based on a historical estimate of spawning biomass during a productive phase of the stock, or a choice of period. And so you can see here that here we have our operational control points up high for rock sole if they're history-based, and down low for BMSY-based ones. So what do you tell managers if the stock's in here? Is it in the cautious zone? Do you need to start ramping down your fishing effort? Or is it fine? Is it totally fine and way above MSY? So we wanted to understand the performance of these operational control points because, these history-based reference points are a lot more precautionary, but at the same time, we don't know how they're going to operate in the context of all the other pieces of the decision-making cycle, which is why we simulate the whole cycle. And these estimates can be biased in themselves. So I'm just going to cut straight to the results, and just to say that there was a huge difference in performance depending on your choice of operational control points. And the only thing really to take home from these kite plots here is that we've got 5 metrics here. We've got biomass over B0, so that's depletion. We've got B over BMSY, which is stock status. We've got the probability of being in the critical zone between in the operating model. And over here we've got some catch-based statistics, the average annual catch and also the average catch. And the bigger the polygon, the better the performance with respect to all objectives. So you can see trade-offs here. So you can see this red one, which is the historical reference points, the dotted lines. did really well on conservation objectives, but really not so well in terms of the economic objectives. And then BMSY, which is this sort of blue one in here, for both stocks, had a relatively small polygon, a really tiny polygon for rock salt. And so we found that these plots are really useful for visualizing how your choices of harvest control will affect all of your different objectives at once, and it just helps communicate with decision makers. So choice of operational control points does affect performance. There were trade-offs in terms of catch and catch variability. You can't just think about your outcomes in terms of conservation. There's obviously a hierarchy, but there's also a fishery out there. We found that the trade-offs and the mechanisms for performance really differ between species, natural mortality scenarios, and harvest control rules, and that bias propagated through the assessments in different directions under different harvest control rules, which meant that the harvest control rules were actually changing the data. So you can't really know how something's going to perform just by looking at it. You have to simulate it and find out how the whole pieces interact. And so we think that these types of desktop closed-loop simulation studies could be applied more broadly to help help managers and stakeholders understand the trade-offs that they are making in terms of their choice of harvest control rules. Or quite often they're not making the choice, it's us making the choice for them. So Andy, I'll let you briefly promote our sections and some of the work coming up, and then we'll be finished.
So this is our last slide. Just thought we'd take the opportunity just to mention some other projects we're working on. So the top one is there's a big push at DFO to incorporate ecosystem considerations into stock assessment advice. So we've got a proposal in, and there could be 3 positions coming up, like postdocs and biology positions. That's kind of why we're advertising this right now. One will be looking at empirical dynamic modeling, which is an approach, kind of equation-free approach to looking at population dynamics. That's Kerry and myself. Size spectrum analysis, so looking at community, the size distributions in the community, looking at cross species, not just looking at single species. Kerry and Robyn looking at impacts of non-stationarity in natural mortality, so not keeping natural mortality constant. Also Sean Anderson, who's just moved to PBS as well, looking at characterizing changes in the range of different BC groundfish species. And also a new one, quantifying consequences of mismatch between sablefish management and coastwide dynamics as well. So these are all potential positions coming up this year, hopefully.
That one is funded.
Oh, that one's funded, okay. And some other work, so Kerry, Kendra and others looking at framework evaluating recovery strategies for Pacific salmon. I guess that ties in with what you talked about. Robyn has contracted with Tom Brothers here at UBC, using a DLM tool, his MSE package, looking at various groundfish species. Robyn's postdoc, Catherine, looking at spatial temporal redistribution of groundfish fleet as a result of the transferable quota system in BC. Myself and Marie Auger-Mette, who's a prof here at UBC, she's doing field work right now. We just submitted a manuscript to Ecology on some guidelines for how to use mathematical notation in ecology, ecological manuscripts. And also we're looking at moving to template model builder. It's a new kind of way of doing modeling instead of a new program instead of ADMB, which has been used for years. So we're looking at developing a new kind of overall framework for doing that within our own assessments. And the team was working on that. Okay, thank you.